Standing in the dusty hayloft of my grandmother's barn, I held the letter that changed everything. My hands trembled as I read her words for the third time. She had been watching me from afar all these years, knowing I was in the system, knowing I had nowhere to go when I aged out. The letter was dated just 6 months before she died, and somehow nobody at Riverside Children's Home had bothered to tell me that Ruth Adams, my grandmother, had left me her entire farm. The afternoon sun streamed through the ways in the old wooden boards, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits around me. I could smell hay and old wood and something else. Something that felt like home, even though I had never been here before. Below me, I could hear the lawyer, Nicholas Castillo, talking to someone on his phone, probably trying to figure out how a 17-year-old girl with no family had suddenly inherited 200 acres of prime farmland in rural Nebraska. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. I want to know if any of you have ever discovered something about your family that completely changed your life, because what I found in that hayloft was so much more than just a letter. But let me start from the beginning, from the day I thought my life was over instead of just beginning. 3 weeks earlier, I was sitting in the common room at Riverside Children's Home, staring at the stack of papers that would officially age me out of the system. 18 was supposed to feel like freedom, but all I felt was terror. Michelle Richardson, my caseworker, sat across from me with that look she got when she was trying to be encouraging, but knew the odds were stacked against me. The thing about growing up in the system is that you learn not to ask too many questions about where you came from. The story I had been told was simple and final. My parents died in a car accident when I was 3. No other family, no grandparents, no aunts or uncles. Nobody who wanted a traumatized toddler with nightmares and trust issues. I had been in and out of foster homes for 15 years, and Riverside had been my home base whenever placements fell through. Michelle was going through my options, which were basically community college and a shared apartment with 2 other girls aging out, or a job at the local diner and a studio apartment I could barely afford. Neither option felt like living, just surviving. I was good at surviving, but I was tired of it. That's when Nicholas Castillo walked in. He was maybe 40, wearing a suit that looked expensive but not flashy, carrying a leather briefcase that had seen better days. He asked to speak with me privately, and Michelle looked as confused as I felt. Nobody ever asked to speak with me privately, especially not lawyers. We sat in one of the small conference rooms, the kind they use for family visits that I never had. Nicholas opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was trying to figure out how to start. "Your grandmother died 4 months ago," he said. "Ruth Adams. She owned a farm about 3 hours west of here, near a town called Millbrook. She left everything to you." I stared at him. The words made no sense. Grandmother, farm, left everything to you. I had spent 15 years believing I had no family, and suddenly I had a grandmother who had owned a farm and left it to me. "I don't have a grandmother," I said. "You did," he said gently. "Ruth Adams was your father's mother. When your parents died, she was already in her 70s and dealing with her own health issues. The state determined it would be better for you to be placed in foster care rather than with an elderly relative who might not be able to provide adequate care. But she knew about me," I said. "It wasn't really a question. She knew about you. She followed your case from a distance. She tried to make contact several times over the years, but the system has ways of protecting children from what they consider potentially disruptive influences. Your caseworkers felt it would be better for your stability if you weren't subjected to the uncertainty of a relationship with an aging relative who might not be able to follow through on commitments." I felt something hot and angry rising in my chest. They had kept my grandmother from me. They had let me believe I was completely alone in the world while somewhere, 3 hours away, an old woman who shared my blood was thinking about me, caring about me, maybe even missing me. Nicholas slid a thick envelope across the table. "This was in her papers," he said. "She wrote it about 6 months before she died. She wanted you to have it when you turned 18, along with the property." My hands shook as I opened the envelope. The paper was cream-colored and heavy, and the handwriting was careful and old-fashioned. "Dear Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are finally old enough to make your own choices about family." The letter was 3 pages long, and by the time I finished reading it, I was crying so hard I could barely breathe. Ruth Adams had written about watching me from afar, about the reports she received from social workers, about how proud she was of my grades and my resilience. She wrote about my father, her son, who had been stubborn and independent and smart, just like she could tell I was. She wrote about the farm, about how it had been in our family for 4 generations, about how she had hoped someday I might want to come home. Home. She called it home like it was mine, like it had always been mine. She wrote about regretting the distance, about wishing she had fought harder to be part of my life, about understanding if I wanted nothing to do with the family that had let me grow up alone. But if I wanted to try, if I wanted to see where I came from, the farm was mine. All of it. The house, the barn, the fields, the equipment, even the old truck that barely ran but had character. Nicholas was patient while I cried. When I finally looked up, he was holding out a box of tissues and looking at me with something that might have been compassion. "The property is in good condition," he said. "Ruth hired a local man, George Cook, to maintain it after she became too frail to manage on her own. The house is small but solid. The barn needs some work. There are about 50 acres currently in corn, and the rest is pasture and woodland. It's not a fortune, but it's completely paid off, and there's enough money in Ruth's savings account to cover property taxes and basic maintenance for several years if you're careful." "What am I supposed to do with a farm?" I asked. "I don't know anything about farming." "You don't have to farm it," he said. "You could sell it, use the money for college or whatever you want to do with your life. Or you could try living there, see if it feels right. George Cook knows the land better than anyone, and he's willing to help you learn if you want to learn." I looked down at the letter again, at my grandmother's careful handwriting, telling me about my father, about the apple tree he had planted when he was my age, about the room that had been his and was now mine if I wanted it. "I want to see it," I said. 2 days later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of Nicholas Castillo's sedan, watching Nebraska farmland roll past the windows. I had never been this far from the city, and the openness of it all was overwhelming. Fields stretched to the horizon, broken up by farmhouses and barns and grain silos that looked like monuments to a way of life I knew nothing about. Nicholas had tried to prepare me for what I would find, but nothing could have prepared me for the moment we turned down the gravel driveway and I saw the house for the first time. It was small and white with green shutters, surrounded by enormous oak trees that must have been planted decades ago. The front porch had a swing that moved gently in the breeze, and there were flower beds that someone had been tending, bright with late summer blooms. Behind the house stood the barn, red paint faded to a soft rose color, with a weather vane on top that pointed steadily west. Beyond the barn, I could see fields of corn that rustled in the wind like they were whispering secrets. "This is it," Nicholas said. But I was already getting out of the car. I walked slowly toward the house, taking in every detail. The mailbox at the end of the drive said Adams in faded black letters. The porch steps creaked under my feet, but they felt solid. There was a rocking chair next to the swing, and a small table with a coffee cup that looked like it had been left there recently. Nicholas unlocked the front door and handed me the key. It was an old-fashioned key, heavy and brass, the kind that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. The door opened into a living room that smelled like lavender and old books. The furniture was simple but well-made, and every surface held photographs in frames of different sizes and ages. I moved from picture to picture like I was walking through a museum of my own history. Here was a young man who had my eyes and my stubborn chin, standing next to a woman in a wedding dress. Here was the same man holding a baby, grinning like he had just won the lottery. Here was a little girl, maybe 2 years old, sitting on the steps of the same porch, laughing at something outside the frame. "That's you," Nicholas said softly. "And that's your father, Michael Torres. Your mother was Brenda Mendoza before she married him." I stared at the pictures, trying to connect the laughing toddler with the angry, scared teenager I had been for so many years. Trying to imagine what my life might have been like if that car accident had never happened. If I had grown up here with my grandmother. If I had never learned to expect nothing and trust no one. The kitchen was small but bright, with windows that looked out over the backyard and the fields beyond. There was a note on the refrigerator in the same careful handwriting as the letter. Sarah, it said, the apple pie in the freezer is your father's favorite recipe. The instructions are in the recipe box on the counter. Welcome home. I opened the freezer and there it was, wrapped carefully in foil with heating instructions taped to the top. Even from the grave, my grandmother was trying to take care of me. Nicholas showed me the rest of the house. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small office that had been converted from a closet. My father's room had been left exactly as it was when he lived here, according to Nicholas. The walls were covered with posters of rock bands I had never heard of and baseball players from the 1980s. The bookshelf held a mixture of classic literature and science fiction novels, and the desk was covered with notebooks filled with what looked like song lyrics and poetry. I sat on the bed and opened one of the notebooks. The handwriting was messier than my grandmother's, but still recognizable as related to mine. He had written about feeling trapped in a small town, about wanting to see the world, about a girl named Brenda who made him think maybe staying wouldn't be so bad after all. I found a letter he had written but never sent, addressed to his mother. It was dated just a few months before I was born. He wrote about how excited he was to be a father, about how he wanted to bring his daughter home to meet her grandmother, about how he hoped I would love the farm as much as he had, even if he had needed to leave it to find himself. He never got the chance to bring me home. The car accident happened when I was 3, on their way back from a weekend trip to visit my mother's family in Colorado. I had been staying with a babysitter, which probably saved my life. Nicholas left me alone to explore, saying he would be back in a few hours to take me to meet George Cook and show me the rest of the property. I wandered through the house like a ghost, touching everything, trying to absorb 15 years of family history through my fingertips. In my grandmother's bedroom, I found more letters. She had written to me every year on my birthday, letters she never sent because she didn't know where I was or if I would want to hear from her. She wrote about the changing seasons on the farm, about the neighbors and their children, about how the apple tree my father had planted was growing taller and stronger every year. She wrote about her regrets, about wishing she had fought harder to stay in my life, about wondering if I was happy, if I was safe, if I knew that someone in the world was thinking about me and loving me even from a distance. She wrote about getting older and more frail, about hiring George to help with the farm work, about making sure everything would be ready for me if I ever came home. By the time Nicholas came back, I had read every letter and cried until I had no tears left. He found me sitting on the front porch swing, holding the most recent letter, dated just 2 weeks before Ruth died. Sarah, it said, I may not live to see you turn 18, but I want you to know that every day of your life, you have been loved. You have been wanted. You have had a home waiting for you. I hope someday you will forgive an old woman for not being braver, for not fighting harder to be part of your life. I hope you will see this place not as a burden, but as a gift, not as an obligation, but as a choice. If you decide to stay, know that you belong here. If you decide to leave, know that you will always be welcome back. This is your legacy, your inheritance, your birthright. But more than that, it is your home. George Cook turned out to be a man in his 60s with weathered hands and kind eyes. He had been taking care of the farm for the past 3 years, and he knew every inch of the property better than I knew the streets around Riverside Children's Home. He drove me around in an old pickup truck, showing me the fields, the pastures, the creek that ran along the eastern border of the property. The corn would be ready for harvest in a few weeks, he told me. Ruth had contracts with the local grain elevator, and the income from the crop would be enough to cover most of the farm's expenses for the year. The equipment was old but well-maintained, and he could teach me how to use it if I wanted to learn. What if I don't want to farm? I asked. Then you don't farm, he said simply. You could rent the fields to other farmers, or sell the property, or just let it sit. It's yours to do with as you please. But if you want to try, if you want to learn, I'll help you. Ruth asked me to look after you if you came home, and I gave her my word. We stopped at the barn, and George showed me the hayloft where Ruth had stored not just hay, but boxes and boxes of family history. Photo albums, documents, my father's high school yearbooks, even some of my school reports that she had somehow managed to obtain over the years. That's where I found the letter I mentioned at the beginning, the one that made everything real. It was in a box labeled Sarah's Things, and it was different from all the others. This one was addressed to me directly, and it was meant to be found here in this place when I was ready to understand what it meant to belong somewhere. My dearest Sarah, it began, if you are reading this, then you have come home at last. You are standing in the place where your father played as a child, where 4 generations of your family have lived and worked and loved. You are not alone. You have never been alone, Debreeze. You are part of something bigger than yourself, something that stretches back through time and will continue long after we are all gone. The letter went on to tell me about my great-great-grandfather who had homesteaded this land in 1895, about my great-grandfather who had survived the Dust Bowl in the Depression, about my grandfather who had modernized the farm and built the barn where I was sitting, about my father who had loved this place even when he needed to leave it and who had always planned to come back. Now it is your turn, Ruth wrote. Your turn to decide what this place means, what this family means, what legacy you want to leave. I cannot tell you what to choose, but I can tell you that whatever you choose, you are loved, you are wanted, you are home. George found me crying in the hayloft as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fields. He didn't say anything, just sat down beside me and waited until I was ready to talk. I don't know how to do this, I told him. I don't know how to be part of a family, how to take care of a farm, how to live in a place where people expect me to stay. Nobody knows how to do it at first, he said. Ruth didn't know how to be a farmer's wife when she married your grandfather. Your father didn't know how to be a father when you were born. Learning how to belong somewhere, how to be part of something, that's just part of being human. You don't have to figure it all out at once. That night, I slept in my father's room, in the bed where he had dreamed about his future and worried about his choices and written songs he never got to finish. I lay awake for hours listening to the sounds of the countryside, the wind in the trees, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of corn in the fields. For the first time in my life, I wasn't listening for footsteps in the hallway, wasn't wondering if this placement would last, wasn't calculating how quickly I could pack my few belongings if I needed to run. I was listening to the sounds of home. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon. George was in the kitchen, cooking breakfast like he belonged there, which I supposed he did after 3 years of taking care of the place. Thought you might be hungry, he said, not making a big deal of it. Ruth always said the best way to start the day on a farm is with a good breakfast. We ate in comfortable silence, and then George took me out to show me the daily routine. Checking the equipment, walking the fence lines, monitoring the corn for signs of disease or pest damage. It was simple work, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. Something that felt right in a way that nothing in my life had ever felt right before. Over the next few days, I started to understand what Ruth had meant about belonging. It wasn't just about having a place to live or even having family history. It was about being part of something that mattered, something that would continue whether I was there or not, but would be different, would be better, because I chose to be part of it. The neighbors started coming by, bringing casseroles and introductions and stories about Ruth. Sarah Roberts from the farm next door told me about how Ruth had helped deliver her youngest daughter when the doctor couldn't get there in time during a snowstorm. Paul Gonzalez from town told me about how Ruth had quietly paid for groceries for families who were struggling, never making a big deal of it, never expecting thanks. Henry Anderson, who ran the grain elevator, told me about the time Ruth had stood up to a developer who wanted to buy up all the farmland in the area for a shopping center. She had organized the other farmers, had spoken at town meetings, had fought to preserve the way of life that had sustained this community for generations. She was proud of you, he told me. Used to talk about her granddaughter who was so smart, so strong, so determined to make something of herself despite everything. She said you got that from your father, that stubborn streak that wouldn't let you give up no matter what. I started to see myself differently through their stories, not as the unwanted foster kid who had aged out of the system, but as Ruth Adams' granddaughter, Michael Torres's daughter, part of a family that had deep roots in this community. It was a strange feeling being known by people I had never met, being welcomed because of connections I hadn't even known existed. But it wasn't all easy. There were moments when the responsibility felt overwhelming, when I would look at the acres of corn and the equipment I didn't know how to use and wonder what I had gotten myself into. There were nights when I missed the familiar chaos of Riverside Children's Home, when the silence of the countryside felt too big, too empty. Michelle Richardson came to visit after I had been there for 2 weeks. She was worried about me, she said, worried that I was making a decision based on emotion rather than practicality. What would I do when George got too old to help me? How would I support myself? Did I really want to tie myself to a place and a way of life that might not have a future? Her questions echoed my own doubts. But sitting there in Ruth's living room, surrounded by 4 generations of family photos, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't running away from something. I was running towards something. I was choosing something. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, I told her. I'm not saying I have it all figured out. But this is mine, Michelle. This is my family, my history, my choice. I've spent my whole life having other people decide what was best for me, where I should live, who I should trust. For once, I want to make my own decision about my own future. She left looking worried but resigned, and I knew she would put a note in my file about a former client who had made an impulsive decision that probably wouldn't work out. But I also knew that for the first time since I had known her, she had seen me as something other than a problem to be managed. The corn harvest came in September, and George taught me how to operate the combine harvester, how to judge when the corn was ready, how to work with the crew from the elevator who came to transport the grain. It was hard, physical work, and I went to bed every night exhausted and sore, but also satisfied in a way I had never experienced before. When the last load was hauled away and the checks were deposited, I realized I had just completed my first successful harvest. The farm had supported itself, had generated income, had fulfilled the contracts Ruth had made. I was not just the owner of the property now, I was a farmer. That night, I called Nicholas Castillo to thank him for everything he had done to help me claim my inheritance. He sounded pleased but not surprised when I told him I had decided to stay, to try to make a real life here. Ruth knew you would, he said. She told me once that you had the same look in your eyes that your father had, the look of someone who needed to find their own way but would know home when they saw it. As autumn turned to winter, I settled into the rhythm of rural life. There were fewer chores with the harvest done, but George taught me how to maintain the equipment, how to plan for the next year's planting, how to manage the business side of farming. I enrolled in online classes through the Agricultural Extension Office, learning about crop rotation and soil management and sustainable farming practices. The house felt more like home every day. I rearranged the furniture to suit my own taste, but I kept Ruth's photographs in her recipe box in the rocking chair, where she used to sit to watch the sunset. I started cooking from her recipes, learning to make the comfort foods that had sustained 4 generations of my family. I've found more letters, tucked away in unexpected places like bookmarks and recipe cards. Short notes Ruth had written to herself, reminders and observations and hopes for the future. Plant the east field in soybeans next year. Fix the loose board on the barn door. Sarah would love the way the snow looks on the corn stubble. It was like having a conversation with her across time, like she was still there guiding me through the decisions and discoveries that came with learning to call this place home. I started writing my own notes, my own observations about the changing seasons and the work that needed to be done. Maybe someday, if I was lucky enough to have children or grandchildren, they would find my words and know that they too belonged here. Christmas was hard. It was my first Christmas outside the system, my first Christmas in a place where I was expected to stay, where I didn't have to worry about being moved or placed somewhere else after the holidays. But it was also my first Christmas completely alone, without even the chaotic community of other foster kids and overworked staff. George invited me to spend Christmas Day with his family, and the kindness of it almost broke me. His wife, Ruth Wood, who shared my grandmother's first name, had cooked enough food for an army. Their grown children and grandchildren welcomed me like I was family, like I belonged at their table. They gave me small gifts, practical things like warm gloves and a thermos for coffee, but also thoughtful things like a photo album for my own pictures and a journal with my initials embossed on the cover. It was the first Christmas I could remember where I felt truly grateful, not just for what I had received, but for what I had to give. I brought apple pie made from Ruth's recipe, and watching George's grandchildren eat it with the same enthusiasm I imagined my father had shown as a child, I felt connected to something larger than myself. Spring brought new challenges and new possibilities. George was getting older, and while he was still strong and capable, I could see that he was starting to think about retirement. We talked about the future of the farm, about whether I would be able to manage it on my own, about what changes I might want to make. I had been reading about sustainable farming practices, about ways to make small farms more profitable and environmentally responsible. I wanted to try growing heirloom vegetables for the farmer's market in town, maybe raise a few chickens for eggs, diversify beyond just corn and soybeans. George was skeptical at first, but when I showed him my research, my business plan, my careful calculations of costs and potential profits, he started to see that I wasn't just playing at being a farmer. I was serious about making this work, about building a sustainable future for the land that had been entrusted to me. We started small that first spring, with just a quarter acre of vegetables and 6 chickens in a coop I built myself, with help from YouTube videos and advice from the hardware store in town. It was trial and error, learning from mistakes, celebrating small successes like the first tomatoes and the first dozen eggs. The farmer's market was intimidating at first. I was the youngest vendor by at least 20 years, and I felt like everyone was watching to see if Ruth Adams's granddaughter would succeed or fail. But the other vendors were generous with advice and encouragement, and customers started to recognize me, to ask for me specifically. By midsummer, I was selling out of vegetables every Saturday, and I had a waiting list for my eggs. People in town started to know me not as the foster kid who had inherited a farm, but as Sarah, who grew the best tomatoes in 3 counties and whose grandmother's apple pie recipe was legendary. I hired 2 high school students to help with the harvest, and teaching them reminded me how much I had learned in just 1 year. I could look at a corn plant and know if it needed water or fertilizer. I could fix a broken fence post and operate machinery that had intimidated me 12 months earlier. I could plan a crop rotation and calculate profit margins and negotiate with buyers. More importantly, I had learned how to be part of a community, how to accept help when I needed it, and offer help when others needed it. When Sarah Roberts' husband had a heart attack during harvest season, I was part of the group of neighbors who showed up to get his crop in. When the tornado sirens went off in July, I knew exactly which neighbors to check on and which basement to head for. The second winter was easier than the first. I had established routines, had projects to work on during the quiet months, had a sense of purpose that carried me through the dark days. I spent time planning for the next growing season, researching new crops to try, attending workshops and conferences to learn from other farmers. I also spent time learning about my family history, going through all the boxes in the barn, organizing photos and documents, creating a record of the generations who had worked this land before me. I found my great-grandfather's journals from the Dust Bowl years, describing the struggle to keep the farm going when the topsoil blew away and the crops failed year after year. I found love letters between my grandparents, written during World War II when he was stationed overseas and she was managing the farm alone. I found report cards and school photos and newspaper clippings about my father's high school baseball career. I found Ruth's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper, and her mother's china, wrapped and stored with a note saying it was for my wedding someday. Each discovery made me feel more connected to this place, more certain that I belonged here. I wasn't just maintaining the farm, I was continuing a story that had been interrupted but not ended. I was the bridge between the past and the future, the link that would carry forward everything that had come before. In the spring of my second year, I made the decision to expand significantly. I leased an additional 40 acres from a neighbor who was retiring, and I invested in a greenhouse so I could start my own seedlings and extend my growing season. I also decided to try something that had never been done on the farm before, something that felt both traditional and innovative. I planted an orchard. It started with my father's apple tree, the one Ruth had mentioned in her letters. It was old and gnarled, but still producing fruit, and I decided to propagate from it to create new trees that would carry forward the genetics of the tree my father had planted as a teenager. I researched heirloom varieties that would grow well in our climate, and I planted 50 trees that first spring. It would be years before they produced fruit, years before I would know if my gamble had paid off, But there was something deeply satisfying about planting for the future, about creating something that would outlast me, that might someday provide for my own children or grandchildren. George officially retired that summer, though he still came by most days to offer advice and lend a hand when needed. At his retirement party, held in the barn with half the county in attendance, he gave a speech about watching me transform from a scared teenager into a confident young farmer. She's got her grandmother's determination and her father's vision, he said. Ruth would be proud of what she's accomplished here, and I'm honored to have been part of helping her find her way home. I cried during that speech, not from sadness, but from a joy so complete it overwhelmed me. 2 years earlier, I had been aging out of the foster care system with no family, no home, no idea what my future held. Now I was standing in a barn full of people who knew my name, who had watched me grow, who considered me part of their community. The third year brought new challenges. Drought in the early summer threatened the corn crop, and I had to make difficult decisions about irrigation and water management. A late frost in April killed some of my vegetable seedlings, forcing me to replant and adjust my market schedule. Equipment broke down at the worst possible times, and I learned the hard way that farming is as much about problem solving as it is about growing things. But I also had my first really profitable year. The farmers market business was thriving. I had established contracts with 2 restaurants in the county seat for specialty vegetables, and the corn and soybean yields were the best the farm had seen in 5 years. I was able to pay off the loan I had taken for the greenhouse and still have money left over for improvements. More importantly, I was starting to think about the future not just in terms of next year's crops, but in terms of the next generation. I was 21 now, and while I wasn't in any hurry to get married or have children, I found myself imagining what it would be like to raise kids here, to teach them about the land and the work and the satisfaction of growing things. I started dating Henry Anderson's nephew, who had come back to town after college to help run the grain elevator. It wasn't serious yet, but it was nice to have someone to go to the county fair with, someone who understood why I loved getting up before dawn to check on the vegetables, someone who didn't think I was crazy for talking to my chickens. The apple trees I had planted that were growing well, already taller than my head, their roots digging deep into the soil that had sustained my family for 4 generations. I wouldn't see fruit for another few years, but I could envision it, could imagine the day when I would pick apples from trees I had planted, when I would make pies from Ruth's recipe using fruit grown from my father's tree. By my 4th year on the farm, I had found my rhythm. The seasonal cycles that had once seemed overwhelming now felt natural, comforting even. Spring planting, summer cultivation, fall harvest, winter planting. Each season brought its own challenges and rewards, its own lessons about patience and perseverance. I had also found my voice in the community. I was elected to the school board, the youngest member in the district's history, and I used my position to advocate for agricultural education programs and farm-to-school initiatives. I spoke at the state capitol about the challenges facing young farmers, about the need for programs to help the next generation stay on the land. People started coming to me for advice. Other young people who were thinking about farming, established farmers who wanted to try sustainable practices, city folks who were considering a move to rural areas. I realized that my story, the story of the foster kid who inherited a farm and made it work, had become part of the community's mythology. But I never forgot where I came from, never forgot the kids who were still in the system, still aging out with nowhere to go. I started volunteering with a program that helped former foster youth transition to independent living, and I opened my farm to groups who wanted to learn about agriculture and rural life. Some of those kids reminded me of myself at 17, angry and scared, and convinced that nobody cared about them. I would show them around the farm, tell them about Ruth and the letter she wrote but never sent, about the family history I had never known existed. I would tell them that sometimes the family you're meant to have finds you in unexpected ways, that home isn't always the place you start, but sometimes the place you choose. One girl, a 16-year-old named Maria, who was about to age out of care, reminded me especially of myself. She was smart and stubborn and determined not to need anyone, but I could see the loneliness in her eyes, the fear of facing the world alone. I hired her to help with the farmer's market, taught her about growing vegetables and managing money and dealing with customers. She's still here 3 years later, managing the greenhouse operation and taking online classes in agricultural business. She calls me her chosen sister, and I call her mine. Ruth would have loved her, would have seen in her the same potential for growth and belonging that she saw in me. The apple orchard produced its first fruit in year 5. Just a few apples from each tree, but enough to make a small batch of peas for the church bake sale. The taste was everything I had hoped for, sweet and tart and complex, carrying the flavors of the soil and the seasons and the care that had gone into nurturing the trees. I took a photo of the first apple I picked and added it to the album of family photos in Ruth's living room, now my living room. It sat next to pictures of my father as a child, of Ruth and her husband on their wedding day, of me at various farmers markets and community events. The album was getting full, and I realized I would need to start a new one soon, one that would document the next chapter of the family story. That fall, I got a call from Nicholas Castillo. He was retiring from his law practice, he said, but he wanted to check in to see how I was doing, to make sure I was happy with the choice I had made to stay on the farm. I'm more than happy, I told him. I'm home. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Ruth knew you would be. She told me once that home isn't a place you inherit, it's a place you choose to build. She said you had the strength to build something beautiful here, and she was right. After I hung up, I walked out to the apple orchard, to the original tree my father had planted 40 years ago. It was still producing fruit, still strong despite its age, its roots deep in the soil that had sustained our family for generations. I picked an apple and bit into it, tasting the sweetness of home, of belonging, of a future that stretched ahead of me like the rows of young trees I had planted. The sun was setting over the cornfields, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that would have made a perfect backdrop for one of those family photos Ruth had treasured so much. I thought about the girl I had been just 5 years ago, sitting in that conference room at Riverside Children's Home, learning for the first time that she had a grandmother who had loved her from a distance. I thought about all the letters Ruth had written but never sent, all the birthdays she had remembered in silence, all the years she had wondered if I would ever come home. I thought about the courage it had taken for her to leave me the farm, to trust that I would know what to do with the gift she was giving me. Now, standing in the orchard as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I understood what she had known all along. Home isn't about the place you come from, it's about the place you choose to build your life. Family isn't just about blood, it's about the people who see your potential and love you into becoming who you're meant to be. I had spent the first 17 years of my life believing I was alone in the world, that I had no roots, no history, no place where I truly belonged. But Ruth had been there all along, watching from a distance, preparing a place for me, believing that someday I would find my way home. The farm had taught me about more than just growing things. It had taught me about patience, about the long view, about the satisfaction of work that connects you to something larger than yourself. It had taught me about community, about the way neighbors show up for each other, about the strength that comes from being part of something that will outlast any individual life. Most importantly, it had taught me about legacy, about the responsibility and the privilege of carrying forward something precious from one generation to the next. I was no longer just Sarah, the foster kid who aged out of the system. I was Sarah Adams Torres, fourth-generation farmer, keeper of family stories, planter of apple trees that would feed children not yet born. The house behind me glowed with warm light, and I could see Maria in the kitchen, probably making dinner from vegetables we had grown together. The greenhouse where she spent her days nurturing seedlings was dark now, but in the morning it would be full of green growing things, full of potential and promise. The barn where I had found Ruth's letters stood solid and strong, its weathered boards holding decades of memories and dreams. The fields where 4 generations of my family had worked stretched out in all directions, ready for another season, another year, another chance to grow something beautiful and sustaining. I walked back toward the house, toward the warm light and the smell of dinner cooking and the sound of Maria singing softly to herself as she worked. This was home, not because I had inherited it, but because I had chosen it. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth the work. Not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. Tomorrow there would be chores to do, decisions to make, problems to solve. There would be weather to worry about and equipment to maintain and 100 small tasks that make up the daily life of a farm. But tonight, there was just the satisfaction of a day well lived, of work that mattered, of a place where I belonged completely and without question. I paused at the porch steps, the same steps where my father had sat as a child, where Ruth had watched the seasons change, where I had first held the key to my inheritance. The rocking chair moved gently in the evening breeze, and I could almost see Ruth sitting there, smiling, knowing that her faith in me had been justified. Inside, Maria called my name, asking if I was ready for dinner. I took one last look at the apple orchard, at the trees that would outlive me, at the legacy I was building one season at a time. Then I went inside to the warmth of the kitchen and the comfort of chosen family, to the home I had found in the last place I ever expected to look. The farm had given me everything Ruth had promised in her letters. It had given me roots and purpose and a future worth working toward. But more than that, it had given me the understanding that love doesn't always come in the package you expect. That family isn't always the people you start with. That home is something you build rather than something you find. 5 years ago, I thought my story was ending when I aged out of the foster care system. I thought I was facing the world alone, with no family, no history, no place where I truly belonged. But I was wrong. My story was just beginning, and it was more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you don't belong anywhere, like you don't have people who truly understand you, I want you to know that your story isn't over either. Sometimes the family you're meant to have, the place you're meant to call home, finds you in the most unexpected ways. Sometimes the thing that seems like an ending is actually a beginning. Ruth used to say that the best crops come from the fields that have been through the hardest seasons. That struggle and difficulty can create the conditions for extraordinary growth. I think she was right about more than just farming. I think she was right about life. The letters she left for me weren't just about the farm or the family history or the practical details of inheritance. They were about the possibility of transformation, about the power of love to reach across time and distance and circumstance. They were about the faith it takes to plant seeds you might not live to see grow, to invest in futures you might not be around to witness. I keep those letters in the kitchen drawer now, next to the recipes and the grocery lists and all the ordinary documents of daily life. Sometimes I take them out and read them again, especially when I'm facing a difficult decision or feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for this place. Ruth's words remind me that I'm not the first person to feel uncertain about the future, not the first to wonder if I'm strong enough for what lies ahead. But I'm also not alone. I carry with me the wisdom of 4 generations of farmers, the love of a grandmother who never stopped believing in me, the support of a community that has watched me grow from a scared teenager into a confident woman. I carry the knowledge that home isn't something you inherit. It's something you create through daily choices, through the decision to show up and do the work and care for the people and places that matter to you. The apple trees are taller now, their branches reaching toward the sky, their roots growing deeper every year. In a few more seasons, they'll be producing enough fruit for a real harvest, enough apples to make dozens of pieces to sell at the farmer's market, to share with neighbors and friends. I like to think Ruth would be proud of those trees, proud of the way they represent both tradition and innovation, both honoring the past and investing in the future. Maria is talking about staying permanently, about making the farm her home the way I did. She wants to expand the greenhouse operation, maybe add some berry bushes, try growing some of the specialty crops that restaurants in the city are always looking for. She has ideas and energy and the same stubborn determination that has sustained this farm for 4 generations. Watching her plan and dream and work toward her own vision of the future, I understand something new about legacy. It's not just about preserving what came before. It's about creating space for what comes next. It's about being a bridge between the past and the future, about carrying forward the best of what you've inherited while making room for new growth, new possibilities, new dreams. The farm is thriving now in ways Ruth probably never imagined. The farmer's market business brings in steady income, the specialty crops are in high demand, and the sustainable practices I've implemented have improved both the soil health and the bottom line. But more than that, the farm is serving its deeper purpose as a place of belonging, a place where people can put down roots and build lives that matter. I think about the teenagers who come here through the foster youth program, kids who are facing the same uncertainty I faced at their age. Some of them light up when they see the greenhouse or the chicken coop or the apple orchard. Some of them ask questions about farming, about what it takes to make a living from the land, about whether there might be a future for them here. Not all of them will choose this path, and that's okay. But for the ones who do, for the ones who see possibility in the soil and the seasons, and the endless cycle of planting and harvesting, there will be a place for them. There will be room to grow, room to learn, room to discover what it means to belong somewhere completely and without reservation. That's the real inheritance Ruth left me. Not just the land and the house and the equipment, but the understanding that home is something you create for others as much as for yourself. She created a home for me across years and distance, through letters I never received and love I never knew existed. Now it's my turn to create home for others, to be the person who sees potential in a scared kid and believes in their capacity for growth and transformation. The sun is setting now over the cornfields, painting the sky in those same shades of gold and orange that have marked the end of countless days on this farm. In a few hours, I'll be up checking on the greenhouse, planning tomorrow's harvest, tending to the endless small tasks that keep this place running. But right now, in this moment, I'm exactly where I belong. I'm thinking about you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from. Maybe you're in a situation that feels impossible, facing changes you didn't choose, wondering if you have what it takes to build a life worth living. Maybe you're feeling alone, disconnected, like you don't have people who truly understand you or see your potential. I want you to know that your story isn't finished yet. I want you to know that sometimes the thing that looks like an ending is actually a doorway to something better than you ever imagined possible. I want you to know that there are people in the world who will love you before they even meet you, who will see your potential and invest in your future and believe in your capacity for growth. Ruth saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, something worth investing in, something worth preserving and nurturing and passing on to the next generation. She planted seeds of possibility in letters I never received, tended them with hope and faith and unwavering love, and trusted that someday they would take root and grow into something beautiful. That's what I'm doing now for the kids who come through here, for Maria and the others who are building their own versions of home and family and belonging. I'm planting seeds of possibility, tending them with patience and faith, trusting that they will grow into something more beautiful than any of us can imagine. So let me ask you this. Where are you watching from? What's your story of unexpected inheritance, of finding family in surprising places, of discovering that you belong somewhere you never thought to look? I want to hear about the people who saw your potential before you saw it yourself, about the moments when you realized you weren't as alone as you thought, about the places and people that taught you what home really means. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me about your own journey to belonging, your own story of inheritance, whether it came in the form of property or wisdom or love, or simply the knowledge that someone believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. Hype this video if it resonated with you, if it reminded you that your story isn't over, that there are still seeds of possibility waiting to be planted and tended and allowed to grow. Share this with someone who needs to hear that they belong somewhere, that they have value and potential and a future worth working toward. Share it with someone who is facing their own uncertain transition, their own moment of wondering what comes next, their own opportunity to choose what kind of life they want to build. Because that's what this is really about, the choosing. Ruth chose to love me from a distance, to prepare a place for me, to believe that someday I would find my way home. I chose to stay, to learn, and to put down roots in soil that had sustained my family for generations. Maria chose to see possibility in a life she had never imagined, to build her own version of home and family and belonging. Every day, we all get to choose what we plant, what we tend, what we allow to grow in the gardens of our lives. We get to choose whether to see endings or beginnings, whether to focus on what we've lost or what we might still find, whether to build walls or bridges, whether to close our hearts or keep them open to unexpected gifts of love and belonging. The apple trees in my orchard are still young, but they're growing stronger every year, their roots reaching deeper, their branches stretching higher. In a few more seasons, they'll be feeding people I haven't met yet, providing sustenance and sweetness for generations I'll never know. That's the real magic of planting for the future, of investing in something larger than your own life, of trusting that love and care and patient tending will create something beautiful that outlasts any individual season. That's my inheritance from Ruth, and that's what I'm trying to pass on to you. The knowledge that you are worth investing in, that your future is worth preparing for, that there are people in the world who will love you into becoming who you're meant to be, even if you haven't met them yet. The farm taught me that home isn't a place you find, it's a place you build, one season at a time, one choice at a time, one act of faith and love and stubborn determination at a time. And if a scared foster kid with no family and no experience could build a home and a life and a legacy on 200 acres of Nebraska farmland, then you can build whatever it is you're dreaming of, whatever it is you're working toward, whatever it is you're brave enough to plant, intend, and allow to grow. So thank you for listening to my story, for letting me share this piece of my heart and my history with you. Thank you for being part of this community, this chosen family of people who believe in second chance, in unexpected gifts, in the power of love to transform even the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful. Keep planting seeds of possibility. Keep tending the gardens of your dreams. Keep believing that your story is still being written, that the best chapters might still be ahead of you, that somewhere in the world there is a place and a people and a purpose that will help you understand what it truly means to belong. And remember, you're never really alone. Even when it feels like you are, even when the silence seems too big and the future too uncertain, there are people who see your potential, who believe in your capacity for growth, who are preparing places for you in their hearts and their communities and their dreams of what the world could be. Welcome home.